talk about game changers. Pokemon for me, it might not have been the first thing I was aware of at the time, but I have a very clear memory still of being in primary school and realising that, like, this cartoon, which I've watched, and once the games start coming out and everything else, I remember realising, like, oh, this is bigger than just something me and my mates are into, or like, it's bigger than just a popular thing. This is like everything, everyone knows about it, everything. It felt like a cultural touch point, if that makes sense. And the fact that it was, I'd always been into like anime and a lot of art out of like Asia and elsewhere as well, but it was the first one that I felt even like my parents got it, even like grandparents, and were at least aware, and like there wasn't this quite dismissive thing of like, oh, it's just some weird cartoon from Japan, or oh right, okay, I don't, well, that's weird. It was this thing of like, oh, this is legit. This everywhere.
There's a funny joke, or it's supposed to be a funny joke, and it even happens now, where someone will mention something like a particular boy band, or they'll say something like Harry Styles, and somebody who's not into that music will go, no, I've never heard of him. It's like, oh, come on, mate. I get it that you're not attracted to him, that you don't like One Direction, but he's in the zeitgeist. Like we talk about the zeitgeist quite a bit, and it's like, you saying, oh, I don't know who Harry Styles is, that makes you look like a dick. You of course you know who he is. What, you don't like? No one's going, oh, you know who he is. Oh, you're a massive fanboy. Oh, you like Harry. No, you're aware of pop culture, and I think it's like, no one could deny that they didn't know or have a basic understanding of what Pokemon was in the 90s, even if it was like just knowing, have heard what it is, and it's, you know, it's a cartoon, it's a computer game, all the way down to, you know, having all the cards and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, it definitely, considering it was, you know, arguably aimed for young kids to play, or like pre-teens, teens, it was a massive cultural phenomenon. Like, it definitely spread far past its initial pitch point.
Yeah, and there was great cartoons at the time. You've got Batman animated series, X-Men animated series, where they've come from an existing property. There's films, or there would be films. There's comics, and there would be comics. But Pokemon hit every market within a very short space of time, out of nowhere, and from Western audiences, from the other side of the world. Like, it was. There was a day when there wasn't Pokemon, and then there was a day when, oh, Pokemon, this is a really cool cartoon, a bit weird, but my kids are into it. So then there's a year where, like you say, trading card game, actual game on the Game Boy, you know, driving technology, these Tamagotchi versions that are Pokemon. Everything had a branded and licensed version. I think if social media was around at the time, it would 90% just be Pokemon things and references, and do you know what I mean? It was that. Well, I mean,
it got like that with Pokemon Go for a while, like.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it still permeates now. That the new version of doing something with this property. There you go.
Yeah. It did, and I think I was maybe a little bit too old, or it wasn't really within my circle of friends, like the playing of it. But you know, I watched the cartoon when it was on. But is there any anime from the 90s that particular that you go to straight away when you think 90s stuff?
Mine's another technical, so feel free to edit this out and cut to yours. But mine for me, it's similar to Star Trek, is Dragon Ball Z.
Okay, yeah.
Now, it's technically started in 89, but at least for Western audiences, and again, from my knowledge, most of the run is in the 90s anyway. It's like between 90 and 96 is the majority of the show. In terms of being syndicated and reshown in the West, I associate it with that decade. And again, not even my formative years, but some of my earliest memories of having a show that I was into and always trying to watch it and going into school and talking about it, was Dragon Ball Z. And again, similar to Star Trek, the early stuff, although it wasn't set in like our reality, you watch it now, you can see a very big shift in style and trends, and I know that comes from the manga that it's taken from, but do you know what I mean? There's a point where you almost feel when it jumps into the 90s.
Yeah.
Even though it's not set in our world in the 90s, do you know what I mean? There's like a very... There's some stuff from the 90s that you'll watch, or from any decade, and it feels like the previous decade because it's still very much those trends and those influences. But
yeah.
There's a lot of stuff where you'll watch it and go, oh, I can feel a massive creative shift in this, and all it is, it's gone from the end of a decade to another one. Do you know what I mean? There's a big shift.
But it's funny because sometimes some certain like IPs you don't feel it. Yeah. You know, you always like it's that funny thing when you look back in life and go, oh, that was very 90s, that was very 80s, that was very like noughties or whatever, and you have this weird unspoken about rule as if there's like a massive, this is the beginning of it and this is the end of it, and either side of it we went, you know, from like hot pants and, you know, yoga stuff, and then it was like, oh, 90s, right, chuck all that out, we've got to get baggy jumpers on and grow our hair and stuff.
Check
like, no.
shirts and grungy jeans.
Yeah, but you know, they all merge really, so there is that fine line of something like, you know, something that was in the 1989 that came out. You could make the argument that actually, even though it was 1989, is way more 90s than something that came out in 98 because of the tone that it changed. I'm going to talk about a couple of things now, if you don't mind. That
go for it.
There's certain when I was constructing my sort of list and looking into it, I found it difficult to make it based on stuff that I experienced during the 90s that was current, and stuff that I've now watched years afterwards and really love. But my first experience of a 90s property was actually within the last few years.
Yeah.
So if we've just talked about animation, I'll go with the more sort of serious angle. So I've got Se7en, the game, and the Pelican Brief, and they are, anyone who's not seen those films, go back and watch them now. I was not old enough to experience them in the majesty and how good they are because I was just way too young. But you watch them, I say you, if you're to watch them now, they're just great. They're great films. There's not loads of CGI. There's barely any CGI in some of them. I've named 3 of them.
Thankfully.
So the Pelican Brief is Julia Roberts and Denzel Washington. Now, they're not churning out films every other year now, but you're supposed to understand that they are amazing actors. If you ever question how good they are, go and watch the Pelican Brief. They are brilliant in it. Basically, the story is that Julia Roberts is at university and she writes a paper called the Pelican Brief about potential insider trading / cover-up sort of scenario. It gets picked up and people are like, well, she's writing a hypothetical paper, but she's actually stumbled upon the truth. So it turns into this big chase thing, and Denzel Washington is a reporter because the police are tied into it. She's scared for her life, and this is where she uses the reporter to be like, the only way I can stay alive is if he makes me too famous to kill, almost. That's not spoiling the film. That is pretty much the setup in the first third of the movie. Yeah. But it's just great, and I don't think there's not a love story between those two characters. There's a relationship that develops out of necessity and mutual survival for them. But it's a really good film. The game, I never watched it in the 90s, only found out about it later on. And when I watched it, it didn't feel dated whatsoever. It's a great story about the super rich having so much money that they don't enjoy things anymore. So there's like these companies that make real life games for you to play, almost like based on like escape rooms almost for now, but on a multi-millionaire level and what they can do, and then how actually it's the scam that gets brought into it. And I'm not going to say any more because it's
best watched mostly unaware.
And I think I wouldn't be bothered about talking about the story like Se7en if the game was a big zeitgeist movie that everyone knew about. I'd be fine talking about the story, but I think there's definitely going to be a lot of people here who haven't watched it. Go and watch the game. Yeah, it's so good. That
definitely flies on the radar a lot more than it should, arguably.
Yeah.
and another one where maybe people don't realise what it is. If you look at some of the posters and the stills, it looks like it almost looks like a low budget Saw style weird horror.
Yeah, because it's got the clown on the front of it and stuff, hasn't it? And but it's just. I remember watching it again. Like I said, I'll say it again. I didn't watch it in the 90s, but I watched it going, how have I not seen this? How is this not like we were talking about Fifth Element in the antagonist episode? How is this not just like one of those films where it's like, hold on, mate, you want to watch a good film? Get on this.
Yeah.
Like it's great.
And two very good conspiracy things as well, which I like. Yeah. That angle. But yes.
And then Se7en is the other one. I loved. Have you heard the not conspiracy theory, but the fan theory around Se7en that
about
it's set
it being Gotham?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely not, but I love that idea because it does kind of work.
Well, it does. If you decide it's in Gotham, it's in Gotham. Apart from them not saying we're in Gotham or whatever,
But then, how many times in the real world do you announce where you live just in a conversation?
Yeah.
If you're not specifically talking about where you live. Yeah, I think the film for me it almost has the city as a character. It's a deprived city. It's raining 90% of the film. All the wooden fixtures everywhere are swollen and sweaty, and it's a very claustrophobic feeling film. And the city is almost like as the reason that John Doe is there as the character is almost like the city in its decay has birthed this horrible character. Plus, what's in the box? Like that is
that's the line. Yeah, that's definitely permeated the zeitgeist in such a big way. I hear people use that reference and not necessarily know what it's from, or kind of have a half memory of like, I think Brad Pitt opens a shoebox or something in one of his films, and they just throw it out there, and it's like, oh no, there's
Brad Pitt's got he's got a fear of boxes just in general, and he can't see a box being opened unless he already knows what's going to be inside it. That's
okay. I thought you were going to say because some of his choices are so outside the box, that's why he's such a good actor, because he's scared of. If you put him in the box,
don't limit my performance, mate. I need to be outside the box. He's never seen a box that he won't be outside of. Morgan Freeman's in it as well, and just and he looks exactly the same now as he did when he was in.
He does, yeah.
Se7en, Hollywood Immortal, mate. Hollywood Immortal.
Yeah.
He's brilliant in it. Like the adversarial sort of pitching between those two, because one's like Brad Pitt's coming in to take over from Morgan Freeman, and actually what's the TV show that's it's a Scandi TV show that's come in,
The Killing.
Yes,
The
Killing. It's almost got the same setup, hasn't it, where he's coming in to take over from her. She wants to leave, but they're not partners, but they've kind of got to be partners at the beginning. And how
then they end up building that relationship, basically.
But I've got the Se7en is it's another good one. I kind of lean more towards the game in my love of those sort of films, because it's not as well known, and it's almost that part of me. Like I've always been looked as the underdog, and I always want to favour the underdog because of it. But those three are probably my sort of, not necessarily my best versions of 90s of stuff, but they sum up a lot of my feelings.
Big standouts of the 90s.
But not necessarily the only ones. Well, this is it. This comes back to a conversation. I don't know if we had it on the pod or we just had it in real life, where actually I ended up realising I was a fan of Fincher, not because I knew he was and what the films he'd done, but when I started talking about my top 10 films, I realised that they were pretty much all Fincher films, and it was like, oh right. So it turns out I'm not this guy who has this, I have a unique take on all films no matter what genre it is. Nope, Fincher apparently, that's my jam.
I've got to mention one for films which is obvious for anyone who knows me or has ever listened to anything we've done. It's a bit of a twofer for Batman. So Batman Returns 92 is one of my earliest memories of watching a film and just wanting to rewatch it. And I've got stories of like family members being like, oh yeah, when you were a kid, like there'd be certain people's house we'd go to that they'd have it on VHS or whatever, and it'd just be like your mum goes to see a mate, and I'm just the annoying kid who sat there, just sticking.
I mean, your mum tells me that you're still that person.
But yeah, Batman Returns, and I do remember, even at the time, being very, very young, realising that there's a few layers there, that it's not just a campy comic book film. There's a little bit of darkness there. I mean, I know that's obvious from looking at it, but I mean, as in, even the tone of it, I remember feeling like there were certain bits where it felt like it wasn't just a joke on the surface. It was almost not as deep as I could tell Burton was making commentary on the idea of the Batman. But I could tell there's something there. For it to suddenly go like, oh, penguins with rocket launchers. There's something in my mind that went, I think there's something that I don't get. But the year after 93, Batman Mask of the Phantasm, which, again, pretentious answer, but I'm not the first person to say it by any means. My favourite Batman film.
You're on -2 points now, by the way. I might turn it into a drinking game.
For me, it is the ultimate way to retell a little bit of a character's origin, add an extra element without ruining other versions. You could still say that this took place in one of the other universes. It just happened off screen from the other bits that were happening. But there's enough new stuff there to go, this is its own little universe. Obviously, it's part of the Batman animated series universe and Justice League animated series and all that stuff from DC. But the execution of it, the darkness of it, the maturity of it, the fact that they give Joker hints of origins in there, and they introduce a love interest for Batman that doesn't feel crowbarred in, doesn't feel cheesy or over the top. It feels real. You really feel what's happening. And it also pays homage to old Hollywood and old cinema and film noir, which the series overall does, but the framing and position of the characters in this, and of his love interest, especially the relationships, you're like, oh, this just feels like I'm watching Casablanca with Batman. You know what I mean? There's this great timelessness to it because it uses certain
I was definitely trying to amalgamate Batman and Casablanca.
Oh yeah, Batablanca. You're not seeing it?
Batablanca.
It's pretty good.
We'll have that. I've got an honourable mention that I want to say before we move on to different genres or games and stuff like that. Wayne's World. I loved Wayne's World.
Yeah.
And I'm going to take it that you're not a fan. When anyone mentions Mike Myers and they think like Shrek or Austin Powers or something, I always think like, I loved Wayne's World. Again, you know what? I think it's the fact that I looked like Hanson, but I wanted to be Kurt Cobain. And they're all in like, their check shirts and the long hair and, showing and all that sort of stuff. I've not watched it as an adult. I don't know whether or not it would stand the test of time, but Alice Cooper's in it. I think it represented a lot of the stuff that I was into. It wasn't necessarily something I was massively into itself, but it was. Yeah. It felt like it was the music I was into, the dressing the way I dressed and all that. So I really big fan of Wayne's World. Yeah. I don't have the same. There's that thing of Wayne's World or Bill and Ted, and it's like you can like both. Deal with it. This guy. Yeah. I get that. I know that one is technically a rip off of the other. I can't remember which one came first, but I know one of them very much came first, and the other one is whatever. For me, it doesn't really matter. I prefer Bill and Ted only because I think I liked it more when I was younger. And obviously, I've tried to rewatch Bill and Ted since in the past couple of years, and I've gone like, okay, I still like it, but if this was my first time watching it, I'd go, okay, all right, okay.
But Wayne's World, I wasn't as big a fan when I was younger. Maybe it went a little more over my head because it's not as obvious, the jokes. Right. It is a little I think the references are a little more subtle than Bill and Ted, if you know what I mean.
Well, I mean, especially the Alice Cooper thing. Like, if you don't know who Alice Cooper is, the whole fact that he's a massive intellectual in real life, he's a very, very well-read individual.
Yeah.
That when you see that in the movie, it's like, well, I don't know who Alice Cooper is anyway. So this is
just like,
I've lost the joke.
He's a clever guy. It's one of those properties where I can see what people mean when they go, do you actually like that? Or is that actually good? Or is it just nostalgia? And there's a lot of things I go, no, I can make arguments for this being a legitimately an objectively good film. Good.
Legitimately. That's what it was.
I can make arguments, you know, and I'll stand there and I'll defend a certain film or game or comic or whatever. And I can say, no, it's good and here's why.
Some things are, you know, completely locked in their time period, and that's neither good or bad. You know, it was made in the 90s. If that's where it sits, that's where it sits. We said at the start of this this episode that some of the films that we'd mention are because of what they represent. Yeah. Now I just need to sneak one last one in there. We won't talk loads about it, but there's a film, Return to Oz, which is like it's not a direct. It isn't a direct sequel to The Wizard of Oz. But what I love about it is there's no music and there's no singing and dancing or anything like that, and it's super dark. But it really turned me on to what how you can reimagine something that people already know. And for me, it was like, oh, this is like as if Tim Burton directed The Wizard of Oz. And so I won't go into loads of it. Even, you know, it's an old film. Go and watch it. It's really easy. It's everywhere. But I just love what it represents. The fact that, you know, it ties into a lot of anime stuff because stuff is like not redone, but it comes out again in a different version. And, you know, and I just love the fact that it just went down a completely different route with it. It looks very different. The tone is very different. And it just really, like I said, switched me on to, you know, being able to change something up quite a bit. So that's why I wanted to bring that in.
And I think I'll add to that as well. I think what you said about it both being and not being a direct sequel, I think it's that example that's perfect of you can count this or you can not count it. It's canon.
Yeah.
But if you don't want it to be, it don't matter. And again, maybe for Wizard of Oz, maybe that's not the hill to die on over canon and what counts. But
mate, we're still trying to figure out the Quicksilver quandary. Like, what is that about?
But yeah, it's like you say, it has that perfect way to say, we're not going to just remake Wizard of Oz and make it dark and cool and gritty, but let's do something with that. Let's find a way to visit that world and that story and do it in a different way, but also leave that intact.
Yeah,
because a lot of people react negatively to remakes and reboots and reimaginings.
Because I think the actual thing behind it is that it is a film version of the books.
Yeah.
So it is a sequel to the movie, but only via the books. Not. Do you know what I mean? It's a movie version of the sequel book, but not necessarily a movie sequel of the movie.
Yeah.
But anyway, right. Next little bits and bobs. Right. What are you going with?
Right. On the subject of books, let's jump
Let's jump the shark.
Oh, let's quickly jump into comics because we've mentioned him already, and I mention him all the time. But Batman, there's two pivotal Batman stories from the 90s, which we've since seen in the past decade or two, at least pseudo adapted on screen, if not just elements. Batman Long Halloween in '96, which is Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale teaming up on Batman for the first time and telling the story of a long Halloween of this serial killer within Gotham who has basically this Halloween theme to what's happening. This is when we see Harvey Dent's sort of descent into becoming Two-Face and really humanising him, and really fun element. And it's one of those stories that I particularly enjoy of certain Batman story arcs where you get to see a few different characters, not just the obvious ones either.
Yeah.
So, you know, you get to play with the rogues gallery that we usually see, but we also get a lot of the organised crime side of Batman's world and a lot of the gangsters from within that, which is nice. And I think it's technically a follow-up to Year One as well. So it's one of those books where you can pick out certain storylines to read after one another, and you get that first 5 or 6 years of Batman's life and Batman's sort of time, which is always good. Obviously, elements of that we've seen since in Dark Knight and Dark Knight Rises and Batman Begins. And the other one being Batman Nightfall from earlier in the 90s, which is when we get the iconic Bane breaking Batman's back. There's loads more within the Nightfall stories than that.
Isn't that like again, Azrael comes into it later on and stuff? And,
exactly, yeah. So there's loads of stuff around that as well, but stuff that Long Halloween I've read so many times. Like it's one of those books that's just quite, you can reread it a lot. Nightfall I'm currently rereading. It's a little older. This is another example of things that it's from the early 90s, but it could have been written in the 80s. It's a little bit dated still. But it's enjoyable. It really is. It's one I recommend for anyone who's into Batman if you've not, to give that a read. A
good way to get into comic books possibly if if you've not done it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. Is there anything I want to is anything I would kick myself for not mentioning? Big Disney fans, so it's like this Toy Story, Aladdin, all those. There was a massive resurgence in the 90s of Disney stuff, or not just the redistribution of older films, but like they came back in full force with Toy Story, Aladdin and stuff, and like Toy Story is still being made now. It's not like they're still on the same continuity as they were. Really pushed the genre or the style, the CGI'd, rather than the hand drawn element. There was the whole fallout of Pixar with Disney. They left Disney, they came back into Disney. I think they were branded almost with the death of hand drawn animation, and the guys at Pixar were like, I don't want that as part of our legacy. So let's go back to Disney and we can do both of this. There's room, there's a desire for both sides of this. Which I think in the world of big business, which there is that massive side of Disney that are big business, it's nice to see that there's still those elements of there is that craft, that love of the craft there.
There's decisions made for the arts, not just for the bank balance. For the bank
balance, but then we've spoke about this before. The argument is definitely there that if you don't have those big bank balances, you ain't making films like the Avengers. They are just not. Like, it doesn't matter how arty and how good your treatment or your scripts are. You need that money behind it to be able to get it off the ground. Computer games were a big thing for me in the 90s. I was a Nintendo kid. There was a big rivalry between Nintendo and Sega, so I didn't have Sonic or anything. You were in one of the two camps. So mine was Mario, big Mario fan. On the Game Boy and on this, I think I had the SNES. I don't think I had the NES. It's a real social thing for me. Like, mates would come round and we'd play like Street Fighter tournaments and Mario Kart and stuff like that. And I think it does tie back into when you were talking about Pokemon. Like, there is that element where you had the link cable, didn't you, between the two Game Boys that you could put on and stuff, and all that came in. There was an element of it that I really didn't like, and that was the getting a mate round to your house and then having a fight with them, essentially, in a computer game. I'm way more. we play online. We play online together, and I'm not really into like the versus thing. For me, it's like
more co-op.
Going together. Yeah. Like, life can be stressful enough as it is. I don't want to jump online and try and shoot my mate. That seems a bit weird for me. But anything that sticks out in your mind that you want to make sure that you cover?
Yeah, so Doom,
yes,
Division 1 in 93 is one of only literally a handful of games that I remember my dad playing and being into.
Oh, right, okay.
So I remember we had a really old computer that I think we built ourselves back when that seemed achievable. Now you have to be pretty good at it.
Yeah.
But
it's not undoable, but you've got to have a
you've got to know what you're doing. You can't half-ass your way through it like we did when I was a kid. But yeah, I remember Killer Kev on Doom. As his save file was, or his whatever was called.
I am definitely going to change his name in my phone now to Killer Kev. 100%.
Yeah, and just being such a talk about like a game changer. Literally, the two or three I want to mention. Doom being one of them in terms of first person shooter, in terms of this is like a horror space opera.
Yeah.
The story behind
Yeah.
it. This is cool. This is pretty crazy. This one man army approach. Tomb Raider in '96, which again, all of a sudden you took quite clunky adventurers and shooter games and puzzle games, and you put it all together in this really polished format.
Yeah.
You know, you look back and it's marketed around being like an attractive woman and whatever. It
doesn't play out with 2020 vision, does it? And 2021 vision, like, I mean, it's a bit.
Yeah, I have seen a lot of stuff kind of bashing it for that, and it's like, but you could also argue it was quite progressive because it's basically taking Indiana Jones and another series and basically saying no, but it's a female lead character, and as much as we enjoy how attractive she's meant to look, she's still badass. She's still the one who's doing all the adventuring, the action. And
I think at the end of the day,
she was forced to be reckoned
it was a good game as well. Like, I mean, as attractive as she was, put on the front of the box and all that sort of stuff. If it wasn't an actual enjoyable gameplay side to it, people aren't going to just keep. That's what you can get a poster for. You know what I mean? Like, you don't need to buy a whole game.
It wasn't a gimmick. It was just an element of her character and a way to show off kind of where graphics were up to and where writing and development was for games. And then one quickly, which I know we've both enjoyed, is Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, right at the end of the 90s, which, and again, another step at the time of, games can be huge. Games can feel like this whole world that I'm falling into, which maybe if I replayed it now, I'd be like, this feels really, really small scale.
I remember playing it and being like, yes, there's a linear story in it, but there's certain, you can complete it in different ways and collect different things around it. So it didn't have this. Obviously, it was the genius behind the guys who developed the game that despite it being a linear game, it had the feeling of you find your own adventure sort of esqueness to it. Which, maybe I didn't play other games that were like that, but for me that felt like the first one from my perspective that did that.
Yeah, definitely, because there was definitely RPGs and JRPGs especially out already, stuff in Final Fantasy series and things where it was this huge epic thing. But I think for more mainstream gamers, which I was more of a, like you say, like typical stuff like you mentioned, I wasn't really deep into games in terms of I had really cool picks and niche picks that, it was very much.
I think the one thing that we have now is the internet.
Good things.
The internet is a massive engine, is it, for being able to search out more niche things, and not even necessarily searching it out. You can just stumble upon things like like we've talked about like the Stanley Parable before and played it. Like, a lot of people will know what that game is, but there's loads of people who have no idea. That's me saying could be the first time they've heard about it. So you do find these things easier now because of the internet. But back in the day, like, you just wouldn't, unless you knew somebody who knew about it, you couldn't stumble upon it really like that.
It's funny when you look back, the genre and the type of story they're telling almost seems quite niche and almost seems quite genre. Like Doom, this dark sci-fi horror mashup. Tomb Raider's like adventuring and Tomb Raiding. Legend of Zelda's like this fantasy, Lord of the Rings meets, whatever. But actually they were quite mainstream games for the most part. Within the games community, the really popular stuff, the good stuff out there, is already tailored perfectly for anyone who's into something a little bit escapist, which is quite funny. And if anything, the really niche games out there are maybe the more either fully surreal artistically, where it's almost like an experience, or the ones where it's almost photoreal, quite dull choices, or do you know what I mean? Yeah. Quite very, very quite mundane consequences and things.
Yeah. Well, that was the 90s.
That's my thoughts on games.
I think there's definitely more things that we haven't covered than we did cover. I mean, just off my list. I mean, there's Space Jam, Silence of the Lambs, Reservoir Dogs. There's all these. The more you look into it, and I think, the idea behind our show is that we take a subject and we go off in a different way, and sometimes we end up spending more time talking about something that we didn't even think we were going to end up talking about, and missing other things. But that's the nature. That's the nature of the show. Sort of thing. Definitely. But I think we'll probably end up revisiting this. Not soon. We'll probably give it, maybe maybe next year or something like that. We'll try and keep hold of our list and talk about the other things. But the more I've looked into it, the more I realise that there's some absolute gems and a lot of them that were around, not necessarily just because they were good in themselves, but what they spawned because of it. Spawn, there's another one. But do you know what I mean? Like the sort of the fallout from it.
Yeah, exactly. Like moments that changed the game or the genre, or change things going forward. Quite a pivotal decade. I guess you could say that about any decade, though, at a certain point. But I think for the age we are and the genres that we're into, I think the 90s was a really important decade for us. Things.
Definitely. And it's all, I think almost in the next time we do visit the 90s, we could almost try and draw some lines from how those properties now affect things that we watch, play, read nowadays. Yeah. Throw some more direct links in to almost like, this is the first domino in the 90s, and now look what it led to.
Yeah,
that could be good.
Definitely.
Yeah, so that was our 90s.
Yeah, that was our first trip back in time to the 90s. Anything we missed, let us know, as always. Search DRH Pod on Instagram, YouTube. Leave it in the comments. Anything else you want to add, Charlie?
Just remember, guys, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Bye.
Bye. It really turned me on